Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and I'm joined again today by Tomer. How's it going today, Tomer?
I'm doing well, Seth. I'm ready for our next pre-constructed deck.
Yeah, we're back today with Vampiric Bloodlust, the vampire deck from Commander 2017. So, like usual, quick deck overview, talk about the new cards. So, Tomer, why don't you take it away? What's your thoughts on Vampiric Bloodlust overall?
I would say out of all the pre-constructed decks, I think Vampiric Bloodlust is the strongest right off the bat, the most consistent right off the bat, and probably my favorite to play. I would say that it is really good if you want to play an aggressive deck that focuses on, smaller creatures, but that they grow and they are aggressive, and they connect in combat, the larger and more threatening they are. They are very much, I would say, a momentum deck. It's very much you want to build your creatures up and then have them sticking around for a little bit of time so they can grow with the battle lords and everything. And then take over the game. They're very much aggressive. They very much want to be attack. And they have a token theme and they have a go wide theme, but they also grow very large. And I really like it. It's a solid deck. It has lots of removal, lots of way of dealing with creatures, and it can deal with pretty much anything.
Yeah, I think this is the most lord heavy of all the tribal decks. If you want to play little things and make them into big things, I think this is the deck that does that the most, and it's got some super exciting new cards. Some of the new cards are really sweet. So let's start off by talking about the new commanders. We have only 3 new legends in the vampire deck, which is a little weird. It's the least out of all of the decks. However, some of them are pretty sweet. Let's start with Edgar Markov, the Eminence card from the vampire deck. Tomer, what do you think of this one?
I would say Edgar Markov is in the running for being the best vampire tribal leader that we have now. I would say he is the best. Right off the bat, in the command zone or on the battlefield, whenever you cast a vampire spell, you're making a vampire token. This is really, really good in a go wide token strategy, which this deck is. And then when he enters the battlefield, he does cost 6 mana. But he does have haste, so he's going to go into combat immediately. And when he does attack, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. Works very well with that initial token eminence ability. So right off the bat, you start building up a token go wide strategy with your vampires. And then when Edgar shows up, he makes them all into 2/2s or 3/3s or even bigger than that. And you have a very sizable scary army, which was once just some lowly 1/1s.
Yeah, and it's pretty sweet that it doesn't need to deal combat damage. All you gotta do is attack, and it also pumps each vampire, so it's attacking as a 5/5 first strike, which does get through a lot more than a 4/4, so you're buffing Edgar to have him survive and be able to attack again the next turn, and it seems like one of the more powerful Eminence abilities. Just, there's a lot of cheap vampires, so with this in your command zone, pretty reasonable chance you're going to start off on turn 1 or turn 2 playing vampires, and having each one come with a free 1/1 kicker is going to add up to a lot of extra power. It gives you extra chump blockers if things are going poorly to stay alive. So I think it's actually a super strong card for any sort of vampire tribal deck, and it is a lot different than some previous vampires. A lot of previous vampire legends were kind of more slower controlling type cards. This one is really pushing you to go wide and be aggressive, which I don't think we've had a commander for that style of vampires. Definitely not in the Mardu colors, but not that many aggressive multicolor vampire commanders at all.
Well, yeah, you're right. The older commander generals, especially like the old school Olivia Volderon, the old school Drana, these are all commanders that are large vampires. They want a lot of mana and they win in slower games. They take control over slower games. Edgar Markov is very aggressive, very much helps you win the game, even if you're tight on mana, for example, because even if you have just enough mana to cast one vampire, you're also getting a 1/1 token for free out of it as well. So you start developing that board state really, really quickly. And he helps you early game, mid game, late game. The only other commander that I would say that is really good for vampires that is aggressive is Olivia Mobilized for War, but she is an entirely different style vampire deck. It's very much a madness deck, a discard matters deck. And Edgar Markov is not like that at all. He is very much a go wide token strategy deck. Very different style of play.
So our next new vampire commander, new vampire legend, Lucia Sanguine Tribune. This one attacks from a really different angle. Doesn't especially care about vampires, but it's a pretty sweet life gain commander. What's your take on this one, Tomer?
I don't like her.
No?
That's the short of it. I think, okay, so best case scenario, you put her in front of a life gain deck, and you gain at least 5 life on a turn that you want to cast her. She comes into the battlefield as a 3 mana 4/4 first strike lifelink that you can pay 5 life to make larger. I feel like that's just not exciting to me. Like, best case scenario, also her discount gets around commander tax, so even if she costs 23 mana to play, if you gain 20 life that turn, you still just have to pay the colored mana of red, white, and black. She's always going to be very cheap in a life gain deck that is actually doing its thing. I'm just not excited for the rest of the card. I don't really care about a 4/4 lifelink first striker that much, even if she can grow herself a little bit more.
I think if you go really deep and really janky, you might be able to turn the paying 5 life thing into a upside. So what I'm envisioning is some sort of Sanguine Bond reset your life total thing. Like we have Oketra's Last Mercy. So you use Lucia intentionally to drain your life total down to a low life, and then you can reset your life total to 40. That counts as gaining life, and you 30 your opponents or something for 3 mana with Oketra's Last Mercy, or some of the other cards that reset life totals, or exchange life totals, where you can switch your life total with an opponent's life total. So maybe there's some way you can take advantage of the paying 5 life combined with life gain synergies to make it more powerful, but that's admittedly going pretty deep in a pretty fringe thing. So I don't think it's a great card, but there might be a super janky deck that you could make work with it.
Well, actually, I love that archetype, and I even made a budget commander article around that archetype of basically life swapping or killing somebody with a huge amount of life gain, bouncing your life total around. And it was under Selenia Dark Angel. I wrote a Selenia Dark Angel budget commander deck, and it was all about that. It was all about manipulating your life total really, really low so you can swap it with your opponents and then kill them easily. But the problem is Selenia Dark Angel just does it a lot better. She does it at instant speed, and you get to control the life total as much as you want. You can pay as much as you want at any amount you want. Whereas Lucia can only pay 5 life once per turn and only on your turn. So she seems so restrictive.
So she's even bad in the janky deck I want her to be good in.
You could do Triskaidekaphobia for her, but it's going to be really clunky because you can only do it 5 at a time. And Selenia does it perfectly. She's the perfect jank commander for that, and Lucia is just lame.
All right, so don't play Lucia. The art is pretty good. I'll give her that. So our last vampire commander, we have Mathis Fiendseeker, which is kind of the bounty hunter commander. What do you think of this one, Tomer? Where does this fit?
This is a politics card for sure. It's also kind of a group hug commander, but also with a twist. Basically, what Mathis does is he helps out all you and some of your opponents except for one person. You're singling out one person being like, I'm not going to help you. And actually, I'm going to encourage everybody to kill your creature. It's really good at dethroning arch enemies, I would say. So if somebody's ahead, you put bounty on their creatures, and then it encourages everybody to deal with the person that you perceive to be the arch enemy, kill their creature, and then everybody gets to draw a card except for the arch enemy. So if somebody's really, really ahead in the game and everybody's scrambling to find answers, putting a counter on an opponent's creature, destroying that creature, suddenly you're drawing 3 or more cards for the group to find answers to deal with this arch enemy situation. So I like Mathis as he kind of really plays well into the politics scene. He not only encourages opponents to not attack you because you're placing bounties on opposing creatures, but he also helps even out imbalances of power at the table if somebody is really, really ahead. Yeah, I like him.
So is this something you can build a deck around as your commander, or do you just play it as kind of a value card in your 99?
I think both. I don't think it's like the strongest card. It's just like a really flavorful card. It's political, and I'm definitely going to play around it for sure. I also with the best synergy with this card. There's actually a card called Bounty Hunter in the game. It's from Tempest Block, and what it does is it's a creature. You can tap it to put a bounty counter on target non-black creature, and then you can also tap it to destroy target creature with any bounty counters on it. So what you could do is with Mathis, you could place a bounty counter on a creature, then you can immediately tap this bounty hunter to kill the creature with a bounty counter on it. It's a really cool bit of synergy from long ago.
That is pretty sweet. Who would have thought that bounty counters in specific would end up mattering? So if you want to build Bounty Hunter Tribal, you got Mathis as your commander.
I think the deck that I'm most excited to run Mathis in is part of the 99 and a Queen Marchesa deck, where I would build a political deck with Mathis as kind of like one of the advisors. He's a bounty hunter. He kind of takes the heat off of you a little bit, where you're trying to be the queen and be the monarch and control the board. And Mathis is kind of putting bounties across the field. And maybe you run some royal assassins too. Just have like Marchesa's like royal guard or something. It's like super flavorful and fun. I don't know. I think he's not really powerful, but he's really fun.
Let's move on to the non-commander vampires. First up, Patron of the Vein, and I feel like I've seen this card a lot of times before. 6 mana, kill something when it enters the battlefield. But Patron of the Vein has a big upside in a vampire deck, sort of like the Hungry Links, where it pumps up all of your vampires. So what's your take on this one, Tomer? Obviously, good in vampires. Is this something you play in non-vampire decks if you want that big, noxious Gearhulk type creature?
It's kind of interesting because I really like the effect that it exiles the creature in Commander more so than other formats. Exiling creature is a really big deal because graveyard shenanigans are so prevalent in the format. Basically, every single color has access to some sort of recursion, and it's very much encouraged to have some sort of recursion. And especially against black-based decks that are all about the graveyards, exiling creatures so it can't be reanimated later is really, really powerful. So I actually do like Patron of the Vein just as a regular creature, because whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, it gets exiled. That's a really big thing. It does cost 6 mana, so it's kind of expensive for that effect. If you're just looking for that effect in general, you just probably want to run like a Leyline of the Void instead. But it's still really solid. And then in a vampire deck, I think this is a new staple. It's kind of like a pseudo lord. It pumps up all your vampires. Vampire decks are very, very good at killing creatures, so it's going to be pretty easy to start stacking up a bunch of +1/+1 counters on your vampires with this.
Yeah, I think the exile clause, as you mentioned, is a really big deal, and it actually can grow into a pretty big threat on its own. When it's not just when it kills a creature, but whenever a creature dies, it not only gets exiled, but it grows itself. So as the game goes along, it's pretty possible that it ends up being a 6/6, then a 8/8, then a 10/10, and it's flying, so it becomes a pretty big threat. So I think this is actually a pretty powerful card. Obviously, at its best with a bunch of vampires, so you can take advantage of the +1/+1 counters to the maximum. But I think it's pretty good just as a standalone, does a little bit of everything, big flyer, hate the graveyard type card. Let's move on to another vampire, the Crimson Honor Guard, which is probably the card I'm most scared of out of all of Commander 2017. Punishes people for not playing their commanders. Obviously, it's good in our meta on Commander Clash, because it'll kill me every week. But is this a playable card outside of killing me, Tomer?
I think very, very similarly to the Territorial Hellkite, Crimson Honor Guard is just a very mana-efficient way to deal a lot of damage to the maximum amount of people. It's just a big damage outlet, essentially. And I do think it has merit in basically any deck that just wants to go full out aggressive, full out group slug. For example, I would totally run this in Mogis God of Slaughter decks, because Mogis God of Slaughter just wants to deal damage to everybody. And he spends most of his time as an indestructible enchantment on the board, very resilient to removal, hard to remove, so you're not going to be dealt damage by the Crimson Honor Guard. Meanwhile, the Crimson Honor Guard is going to be doing a ton of damage. 4/5 Trampler for 5 is pretty decent, but the fact that it's dealing 4 damage potentially to each player on each upkeep is pretty good. And again, we're talking about vampires. Vampires are really good at killing creatures, so it's going to be pretty easy for a vampire deck or a red deck in general to just remove opposing creatures or opposing commanders to keep dealing that damage.
Yeah, I think that it actually plays in a really interesting way. If you're in a meta game and your play group is playing a lot of expensive commanders, this obviously gets better. But even as the game goes along, you're gonna, at times, when people get to low life totals, kind of force your opponent to time walk themselves to recast their commander to avoid taking a potentially lethal amount of damage or going so low in life that they're dead. So there's some weird upsides to the card in certain matchups and certain metagames. So I like how it plays. And the body's not horrible. Like, is a 5-mana 4/5 that's not exciting, but it's pretty much on curve anyway. So I think it's a really unique way to build a card that does something different to Commander that we haven't really seen before. We haven't seen players being punished for not playing their Commander. So I think it's a really cool card to exist, but I don't know if I would, the style of decks I play, I don't imagine myself playing this card very often.
Yeah, this is going to be the bane of Atog or Chromat Durley decks. I guess not so much because we're about to get Ramos, and Ramos actually does good things in those spots instead, but yeah, it's gonna be fun as like an anti Seth card.
Well, let's move on to an uncommon, which is kind of weird. We've talked about the uncommons at the end in previous videos, but this one is actually kind of different. It's not one of the generic curses. Bloodline Necromancer, so a vampire reanimation spell, also a little crossover with the Wizards deck that we'll be talking about in the future. What do you think of this one, Tomer?
I think it's good. I mean, Gravedigger is a 4-mana creature that's a 2/2 that returns a creature card from the graveyard to your hand. Obviously, nobody's going to be playing that in Commander because we just have a lot better things. But for 1 more mana, you get a slightly bigger creature that has lifelink, and it puts a vampire or wizard from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you can cheat creatures into play. And you just save a lot of mana in that way. I think it's pretty solid. It's not terribly exciting, but there are going to be decks where it's actually quite good. For example, Marchesa, the Black Rose, is a fairly popular commander that basically gives all your creatures kind of like Undying, I would say. Your creatures have the Throne, so they get a +1/+1 counter when they attack the person with the highest life total. And then whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you return that card to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. So you could, for example, just keep having the enter the battlefield trigger happening over and over again. So you have this like recursive engine with Bloodline Necromancer. I think that's where the deck is going to be really shining. In decks that can abuse its enter the battlefield effect. So Panharmonicon decks, Blink decks, Marchesa decks. These are going to be the decks that are going to really, really abuse Bloodline Necromancer.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Creatures that reanimate creatures always have a lot of potential. You think of stuff like Karmic Guide, and this is obviously a lot more restricted because it's only vampires or wizards, but it's still a pretty powerful thing that's worth taking notice of. And interestingly, it seems like it might even be at its best with the wizard deck, even more so than it is in the vampire deck because of how Inalo works in the wizard deck, being able to double up these type of triggers. So it's interesting to see it in the vampire deck, and I guess it makes sense, but I think this is more of a wizard's card as far as the out-of-the-box commander decks are concerned.
Yeah, I agree. It's good with vampires. It's a vampire. It's nice. but it's going to be even better in the wizard deck.
Let's move on to Bloodsworn Steward. I mean, another on-curve card. For some reason, I have a hard time getting excited about these kind of cards. 4/4 flyer for 4 is on-curve. It has an interesting ability. We have had cycles of doing things to your commander before, similar to this, that I haven't really seen be played heavily in the commander games I've played, at least. What do you think about this one, Tomer? Is Bloodsworn Steward a playable card in commander?
Well, it's good. I mean, yeah, like you said, it's highly efficient at what it does. It's a 4/4 flyer for 4 that's already good stats, and it has extra good riders on it that are interesting, but at the same time, will it see a lot of play? Probably not. There are going to be some situations where I think it's really, really fun. For example, Tana, the Bloodsower, is not the most popular partner, but basically, she is a 2/2 that whenever she deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green sapperling creature tokens. So obviously she wants to be larger because the more power she gets to hit, the more tokens she make. And Bloodsworn Steward is an easy way to give Tana haste and also pump out 2 more tokens whenever she swings. So that's really, really mana efficient, especially when you're considering you also have a 4/4 flyer that can also attack and block relatively easily. There's also going to be some cute synergies in particular vampire decks. For example, Olivia Volderon has the ability to steal opposing creatures. And there's also a new card that we're going to be coming up to called New Blood that also can steal creatures, including other commanders. So it'll be cute to have your commander and then also opposing commanders that you're stealing that you're also giving +2/+2 in haste and immediately attacking with. So there are some cute tricks. It's not a really strong card, but it will have a couple really specific uses.
It seems like it could be beneficial as well if your goal is to kill your opponent with commander damage. The haste is a nice upside if you're Voltroning your opponent with your commander, and the +2/+2 doesn't hurt either. So it gives you a way if your opponent deals with your commander, you're getting it back and you're not having to wait an extra turn to get in that hit and maybe kill your opponent. So I think it's maybe has potential there as well. But overall, it seems like it's interesting in certain situations, but I don't think you just play it for value. +2/+2 in haste, unless you're really built around it. I don't know if that's enough of a benefit that would make me just play this card in a random deck.
Yeah, also keep in mind that, yeah, it's a 4/4 flyer for 4, which is good stats, but it's also a creature, which means it's the most vulnerable to the most popular removal spells in Commander. So it's not going to be, if you want haste, it's not going to be a replacement for example, Lightning Greaves, or even Fervor, or like enchantments or artifacts that will give your commander haste. It's not a replacement for that. It's more of a redundancy for that.
Well, let's move on to Kairu Mind Eater, which kind of a Night Veil Spectre, kind of a next in a long line, I guess, of 3 mana creatures that kind of generate card advantage, disrupt your opponent. It's like a cross between Abyssal Spectre and a Night Veil Spectre and the John Finkel card that I can't think of the name of, Shadowborn Infiltrator. Yeah. So what do you think of this one? Where does this fit in that hierarchy of very similar 3 mana creatures in black?
I mean, it's small. It comes out at 3 mana, so it's one of the cheaper vampires. It has menace, so it has a little bit of evasion. The nice thing is that it's just nice card advantage. Whatever you get, you're going to get the worst card from your opponent, or like a card that the opponent just doesn't want to cast anytime soon. But a card is a card, and it is a vampire. So I can see myself just putting it in a tribal vampire deck because I want an earlier attacker that will gain me some cards down the road. Yeah, I'll definitely run it in tribal vampire decks. Outside of that, probably not.
It's a little weird to me that it's formatted without saying that you can pay mana of any color to cast the spells, which is actually sort of a kind of a big drawback compared to like Gonti that we've seen and stuff. So if you're playing this, I think you really want to make sure you have chromatic lanterns, other things that can add colors of mana that your opponent has, because you do have to pay the mana cost, and it does include the colors of the card. So if you're playing a mono black vampire deck and you steal a blue card, you gotta have a way to make the blue mana if you want to cast it, which I just found weird more than anything, because it seems like they've moved more towards formatting that, with most recently, like Gonti, allowing you to pay any color of mana when you steal your opponent's cards like this.
Yeah, I kind of just assumed that was the case, but that's a good call. Okay, so it got a little bit worse in my ass. It's definitely not like a Night Veil Spectre 2, where you're getting a random card as opposed to your opponent's worst card. But I mean, you are disrupting their hand at the same time. You're removing a card from their hand and gaining access to a card. So, I mean, I'd still run it in tribal vampire decks. Is it a great card? No. Would I put it in other in non-vampire decks? No, but it's fine.
Well, let's move on to a great vampire card. I love this card. New Blood.
Oh my goodness.
The vampire sorcery control magic. What do you think of this one, Tomer?
Yeah, this is my favorite card from the vampire deck, I think. It's basically a permanent control magic, because if you remove, there's no aura to remove to return control back to the owner or anything like that. And you do need to tap a vampire to cast it, so there's an extra hoop that you need to jump through. But it's well worth it, because not only are you stealing a creature permanently, which is great, especially if you're stealing opposing commanders and stuff. So not only can't they not recast their commander, they have to actually kill their commander before they can recast it. That's great. But it also changes all text of that creature by replacing all instances of one creature type with vampire, which opens the doors for a lot of really cool synergies. It's actually a really good answer to opposing tribal synergies. For example, first of all, it helps that it's suddenly a vampire, because then there's it plays into all your vampire lord synergies. For example, you can tap it as a vampire for captivating vampires to steal other vampires. It gets bigger due to Bloodline Keeper and stuff like that. But if you're stealing opposing tribal matters creatures like Krenko Mob Boss taps and produces goblin tokens equal to the number of goblins you control, but you're changing into a vampire, and now it can tap to produce vampires equal to the number of vampires you control. So suddenly you have your own vampire Krenko. Or if you steal an Elvish Archdruid, suddenly it's tapping for green mana equal to the number of vampires you control. Or Sliver Overlord, now you can tutor for any vampire in your deck. So there's a lot of just silly things you can do, especially if your opponent is tribal.
So this is one of my favorite cards too. It's super powerful. Sorceries are easier to recur because they're not enchantments staying on the battlefield, so you can use it again and again potentially. There's so many sweet things about it, but at the same time, this card makes me very sad because I'm about 99% sure that I'll never get to play it, because just listening to you describe making vampire tokens with Krenko, for example, makes me pretty confident this one will not make its way onto Magic Online.
We'll see. I have hope. They have cards that change creature types. I don't know if New Blood is going to make it, but I mean, there's a precedent.
That's true. And last question for this one, Tomer. How many vampires do you need? To make this work in your deck? Obviously, Vampire Tribal, you're fine no matter what. 5, 10, 15? What's the number?
I think 10 is safe. Especially if your commander is a vampire, then you're good. I think that would be the bar. And then if you don't have a commander that's a vampire and you have 10 vampires in your deck, then I think you're still good.
Okay, that sounds about right. I was thinking somewhere in that range. Let's move on to maybe one of the weirdest and most exciting cards from Commander, Teferi's Protection, the return of phasing. What is going on with this card, Tomer, and what can you do with it?
So Ramos is my favorite card that is a commander from the set. Teferi's Protection is my favorite non-commander card in the set. This card is so fun. So right off the bat, it's a huge flavor win, but I'm not going to go into that because then we're going to go too long. But First of all, it's just an ultimate protection card. If something of yours is being targeted for removal, or if your creatures are about to get hit with a Wrath of God effect or something like that, even if you're being targeted by a lethal Comet Storm or something that's going to turn your life total to 0, a lethal attack, anything, you can cast Nefarious Protection and nullify it. It's incredibly powerful defensively, but things are much more interesting once you even start building around it. For example, it's very trivial, and basically any white deck is going to have like a Wrath of God effect. So if you have 7 mana and you have Nefarious Protection and a Wrath of God and you have creatures on the battlefield, you can Wrath of God, and then in response, you can cast Nefarious Protection, remove all your creatures, phase them all out, and then Wrath of God happens, you destroy all your opponent's stuff, your stuff gets left out. If you're particularly cruel, you can also do this with Armageddon, because it also phases out non-land permanents too, or it also phases out land permanents too, so you can remove everybody's lands while keeping yours intact. You can also do a little bit even cuter things. For example, Feldar Sovereign. Whenever you have a 40 or more life at the beginning of your upkeep, you win the game. Well, you're vulnerable to disruption until your upkeep, right? So you can play Feldar Sovereign. You can cast Nefarious Protection. Suddenly, your life total can't really change. Nobody can get rid of the Sovereign, and then they can only deal with it at instant speed at the beginning of your upkeep while Feldar Sovereign's trigger is on the stack. So there's a lot of silly things you can do with Nefarious Protection. It's good in basically any white deck.
Yeah, it seems it just combines so many powerful things together. It's like an Angel's Grace. It also protects all your permanents. You can use it aggressively, like you said, just all around. There's very little reason not to put this card in your deck. You're going to find some amount of value from it almost no matter what. It's just very powerful, very unique. I really like this card as well. Well, let's move on to Disrupting Decorum. This card is weird. So is this a red fog? Am I reading that correctly? Like, I read this as sort of a red fog that maybe deals some damage to your opponents.
It's a red fog, but it's a sorcery speed fog. So if your opponents are about to like drop down a huge hasty beater or like win out of nowhere, that's not going to save you because you have to be preemptive about it. But it is I would say it's a fun casual card that I really like seeing in commander decks because they can get away with it. It basically just deals a lot of damage to your opponents. Everybody has to attack, but they can't attack you. So everybody's swinging everywhere, and it's just fun. It deals a lot of damage indirectly. It's kind of like a much smaller scale insurrection, I would say, where instead of winning the game when you reach 7 or 8 mana or however much insurrection costs, you're paying 4 mana to just make sure you're not being hit this turn while everybody else is swinging at each other. So it's still really good. I would love to put it in decks that are built around giving your opponents creatures and then forcing them to attack everybody but you. I have a Knaos and Tyro deck that is built like that, and I also have a Gahiji Honored one that is built like that. So if you are curious about those, you can look those up on the MTG Goldfish website. It's all about giving your opponents creatures and then encouraging them heavily to attack each other with them.
It also seems like it could maybe work in, like, the red random decks. There is this random element to it, even though it doesn't say random, but the fact that you're forcing everything to attack and not attacking you creates this kind of, like, chaos during the attack phase, because your opponents maybe didn't want to attack at all and wanted to leave things on defense. It also can oddly be used aggressively, because if you think about a typical board state, everyone has to attack. They're not attacking you. That means when you untap, all your opponents are likely going to be tapped out, and you have free reign to swing and kill whoever you want to with your creatures that were left untouched during the chaos of the last turn cycle. So,
yeah, it really sets up for your lethal swing. The only things that they will have untapped are stuff with vigilance and new creatures that enter the battlefield, essentially. So there are shenanigans to be had there. Just note that the more creatures that are on the battlefield, the more powerful Disrupt Decorum is going to be. Well,
let's move on to the next Kindred. Kindred Boon, the White Kindred. the return of divinity counters. So the first thing I heard about this card was you got to use it with the Myojin, whatever those cards are from Kamigawa, to keep resetting the divinity counter. You can reanimate them and put divinity counters on them. Is there any uses outside of Myojin Tribal?
I think the Myojin Tribal is probably the best use of Kindred Boon. Outside of it, I mean, most tribal decks are going to be creature heavy. That's just how it is, right? And the creature heavy decks are usually vulnerable to removal. And Kindred Boon shores up that vulnerability by making all your creatures every 2 mana that you spend makes another creature indestructible. So that in theory is a very powerful ability. And I do like it, and I do think it's going to see some good use. However, I just think it's such a huge mana investment that I don't know if it's worth it unless you're actually using the Divinity card for something more interesting, like the Myojins. So for example, you have to spend 6 mana total to make 1 creature indestructible. You have to spend 8 mana total to make 2 creatures indestructible. 10 mana for 3, and so on and so on. And the enchantment itself is not indestructible, so it could be disrupted somewhere along the way. I would say if you want that effect, I would just go ahead and spend the 8 mana on Avacyn, Angel of Hope, which is an 8/8 flyer vigilance, and she is indestructible, and all your permanents, not just your creatures of the chosen type, are indestructible.
I will say, yeah, I agree with you. I don't think the card is super good to be used fairly, but I really love that Wizards seems to have intentionally made an effort to kind of make some older, weirder cards relevant. We talked about Okagachi being the 5-color spirit commander that we've never had before for Kamigawa. We're talking about Myojin. We've never had a way to interact with them or make them relevant in Commander. So we talked
Mathis,
about Bounty Hunter.
Yeah.
So it seems like they really went out of their way. And I'm assuming this was intentional. It seems like they were intentionally doing these things. And I think it's really awesome that Commander gives a place for this to matter. It would be very easy for us to go through another 20 years of Magic with Myojin not really being relevant, but now Kindred Boon makes it so people are excited to build this really weird commander deck that wasn't a thing before. So I really love that aspect of Kindred Boon. It kind of exemplifies all the good things about Commander, even though the card itself isn't generally that powerful. The meaning of it and the bigger picture of it, I think, is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially this card might be even more relevant if they start printing more cards with divinity counters too.
That's true. You never know when we'll get a divinity counters. That Return to Kamigawa confirmed.
Return to Kamigawa, here.
Well, speaking of kindreds, we got another one. All the kindreds all the time. Kindred Charge. Interesting effect. What do you think of this one, Tomer?
This card is both a finisher and a big splashy effect. I can't say I'm too excited about Kindred Charge, but I am going to guarantee you that I'm going to die a lot to Kindred Charge, probably by Richard or Tom. The nice thing about Kindred Charge is, first of all, like I said, it's a finisher. You just have an army of non-token creatures. You double that army. You swing for double that damage. It can kill people really quickly. But it gets a little bit more interesting because it also triggers, the tokens also trigger enter the battlefield effects, and also can trigger independently combat triggers and stuff like that. So, for example, you could do Krenko Mob Boss. You can cast this spell in Krenko Mob Boss decks to produce a big board state with Krenko Mob Boss, and then use Kindred Charge to double that board state, and then have a copy of the Krenko and just sacrifice the original. Now you have an untapped copy of Krenko. You tap it for an enormously huge board state, and then swing for lethal. Perforos, God of the Forge, loves it when creatures enter the battlefield. So if you have a big token army, Kindred Charge is going to double that token army. You're probably going to kill everybody in one go with Perforos. So there's a lot of interesting things you could do with Kindred Charge.
You're thinking way too aggressive, Tomer. Just durdle, Panharmonicon, Kindred Charge, double up your Cloud Blazer triggers,
yeah.
Some Restoration Angels to get even more triggers, and just draw so many cards.
Have an eternal witness so you can get back Kindred Charge and do it again.
That's where I see this card for me.
Yeah.
It looks like an aggro card, and I think that's the intended purpose, but it has some Dirtle potential as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It straddles the line. It can be Dirtle, it can be aggro, it can be both.
And that makes it a good card, I guess, in some sense. Lots of possibilities. Well, let's move on to the uncommons. I think we've talked about most of these already. However, we haven't talked about the Black Curse, Curse of Disturbance. So, Tomer, any takes on the Black Curse? Where does this fit on the curse scale?
Well, first I'll say, if you want to hear us talk about Heirloom Blade and Curse of Vitality, go check out the Cat deck, Feline Ferocity. That's where we talked about it. But as for Curse of Disturbance, I was originally kind of meh about Curse of Disturbance, and now I'm kind of okay with it. First of all, I don't think getting a 2/2 black zombie creature token is that much of a draw for people. I mean, it is. It's better than Curse of Vitality, I would say, but that bar is not very high. And also, I think it's best used in a zombie deck, because obviously you suddenly get a token that is a relevant creature type for your deck. You have a lot of zombie lords. Your zombie tokens are going to be worth more than your opponent's zombie tokens, and that's really good for you. However, your opponents probably will recognize that immediately, especially if you have a zombie lord already on the battlefield, and they're probably going to be less incentivized to attack the person you curse because they don't want to give you, the zombie player, a zombie token. One interesting way that viewers said that you could use it is you can actually just curse yourself. So suddenly, if you're in a zombie deck, you curse yourself. Opponents are not going to be dissuaded from attacking you, because not only are you getting a blocker, it's going to be a zombie, so it's going to be an even better blocker or token than your opponents. So that's actually a kind of like a black propaganda in a zombie tribal deck. Outside of zombie decks, I don't really think this is too interesting. Maybe in a sacrifice deck that wants just lots of creatures to be sacrificed for value, this would be good. But otherwise, I don't find it too interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a little odd that it's not vampire tokens or even wizards or something that's relevant with the commander tribes. But I guess making it zombies makes sense in the bigger picture. There's lots of 2/2 zombie tokens running around. I think it's obviously better than the white curse, but 2/2s, unless you really have a way to abuse them like you were talking about, just aren't that exciting, and you're not even really coming out too far ahead because your opponents are getting the 2/2s too, so I'm not super excited about it. I think outside of zombies or like a curse-focused deck, not a whole lot to do with Curse of Disturbance. Anyway, that brings us to the end of Vampiric Bloodlust, the vampire deck. So Tomer, any final thoughts on the deck on the way out the door?
So I would like to say something about the colors of Vampiric Bloodlust. They're usually primarily black, and sometimes they're in red as their secondary color, their official secondary color, especially in Innistrad block. You don't really see them in other colors. They're never in green. They're sometimes in blue and sometimes in white. We have a Marduk commander, and again, there's just not a lot of white vampires. There's Edgar Markov, and I think like maybe 4 others at this point. So white doesn't bring a lot in terms of vampire tribal at the moment, but it does bring a lot of things that black and red typically struggle with, and that is usually enchantment removal. Black and red do not have any good means of dealing with enchantments, and white comes in and deals with enchantments very well. It also offers just better ways of removing artifacts and enchantments, and it opens up a lot of black-white removal spells like Anguish and Making, Vindicate, and those sort of stuff, Utter End and those sort of stuff. So white does bring a lot to the deck, not necessarily in terms of vampires, but a lot to just shore up the color's weaknesses. And something interesting to note is we do know in Ixalan that vampires are going to be a supported tribe, and that we're going to see a lot of vampires in white. So Edgar Markov actually is a great bridge between the older vampires and the new upcoming vampires that we're going to get, and you're going to get to play all of them in a Edgar Markov deck. So that's something to keep in mind in the future if you're looking to upgrade. There's going to be new white vampires that you're going to take advantage of in Edgar Markov that you normally wouldn't in older vampire commanders like Olivia.
I think that does it for Vampiric Bloodlust. So Tomer, thanks so much for hanging out. It's always fun.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure.
And thanks to everyone for watching. So we'll be back tomorrow for one more The Wizards deck. Until then, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.